Black Horse of Dartmoor. The fog had begun to rise shortly before dusk, spreading across the Dartmoor moors like a thick, silent veil. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly crushed heather, and the old twisted oaks looked taller, older, when the mist swallowed half their trunks. It was a windless night, a night when every sound traveled slowly, softened, as if the whole world were holding its breath. Ailise walked carefully along the path that traced the low hills. Her boots, worn down by use and by Devon's fickle weather, made a faint crunch against the wet leaves. It was barely a sound, and yet, in the stillness of the night, it seemed like a deliberate whisper, something someone, or something, might hear from miles away. She drew in a deep breath. The cold scent of heather steadied her. She had grown up among those hills, in a small stone cottage her grandmother called a refuge, though to Ailise, it was simply home. Every afternoon she helped carry water from the well, grind herbs for infusions, and feed a few of the neighbors' sheep. Simple things, ordinary things. Ailise was used to the peace of the moor, but she had also grown up listening to stories. Stories of creatures that moved inside the mist, shadows that took shape at the edge of the road, small flames dancing through the tall grass, guiding travelers or leading them astray. And of course, the oldest tale of all, the one about the Black Horse of Dartmoor. She could not remember when she had first heard it. Perhaps when she was 5 or 6, sitting at the edge of her bed, while her grandmother blew out the candle and left her to sleep. On nights like this, heavy with fog, the old woman's voice would lower into something almost reverent. There is a black horse that appears when the land forgets its own shape. It carries no rider. It does not need one. Its hooves leave red tracks like newly stirred embers. Some say it gathers the souls of those who never truly said goodbye. Others say it searches for something else, something lost. Never follow it, Ailise. Never. But Ailise, now 13, was no longer an impressionable child. Or at least, that was what she told her grandmother. She had learned to tell real sounds from old tales. She knew every stone in the path, every twig that snapped beneath the weight of a fox passing in the night. She knew the darkness was gentler than it looked. And yet that evening, there had been a strange premonition, a soft, persistent sensation, as if someone had whispered her name from very far away, carried on the fog. She felt it when she latched the shed door, when she filled the water bucket, when she set the kettle over the fire. It was not fear, it was a summons. Something that did not ask her to run, but to step outside. Ailise tried to ignore it. But while her grandmother drifted asleep in the rocking chair, soothed by the warmth of the hearth, the girl looked out the window and saw the dark outline of the hill fading beneath the mist. And in that instant, she knew she had to go. Not to search for anything, only to understand. She slipped through the door without a sound, left the smell of wood smoke behind her, then followed the path that sloped gently downward, winding like a long arm toward the heart of the moor. The moon was completely hidden. The only light came from a pale glow that seemed to rise from inside the fog itself, a gray radiance that revealed just enough. With every step, the silence thickened. The world seemed suspended. Then, once she had gone farther than she ever should have, she heard something different. A dull, steady, rhythmic thud. It was not the wind, not the grass rustling beneath some small creature. It was heavier than that, more deliberate, like hooves. Ailise stopped. Her hands trembled, but she did not step back. The sound came from the open stretch of land to her right, where the grass grew in dark, stubborn clumps. The fog was thicker there. It almost seemed to shift and ripple, as if it were breathing. The hoofbeats drew nearer. Thud, thud, thud. A deep, ancient pulse. Ailise felt the air change density, as though time itself had drawn inward around her. She had the impression of a vast shadow taking shape inside the white veil. First a low outline, then a rise in height, then a movement that could have been the curve of a neck or the sweep of a back. The sound stopped. For one instant, the moor held perfectly still. Then she saw it. The horse emerged from the fog as though it had been shaped by the mist itself. It was black, so black it caught none of the pale light around it. Its mane looked like a fragment of night, moving slowly despite the absence of wind. It wore no saddle, no bridle, and yet it moved as though some invisible presence guided it. Its eyes shone with a deep, almost bluish hue, and wherever it stepped, glowing footprints appeared behind it. Small red marks that did not burn the grass, but lit it from within, like embers sleeping beneath the earth. A shiver passed through Ailise. Not fear, something larger. A mix of awe and recognition, as though she had seen this figure before, in blurred dreams she never remembered by morning. The horse turned its head toward her. Ailise parted her lips, but no words came. The creature looked at her with an unfathomable calm, as if weighing her breath, her story, the shape of her soul, as if it knew who she was before she did. Then it took one step forward, and another. The embers beneath its hooves brightened into a quiet line. Ailise should have run. The stories made that much clear. But when the horse came closer, she felt something impossible. An ancient tenderness. A memory that did not belong to her, as though some old, forgotten corner of the moor had been waiting for her all along. The horse slowly lowered its head, not in threat, not in command, but to show her something. Ailise followed the direction of its gaze. There, beyond the thickest wall of mist, another shape seemed to form. Something human, barely more than an outline, a still figure, a fragment of shadow in the shape of a person, neither advancing nor retreating. Ailise felt her heartbeat quicken, not with fear, with recognition. That outline felt familiar. The black horse exhaled a dark breath that spread quietly into the fog. And that was when the girl understood that something did not fit the stories her grandmother had told. The black horse came for souls that had lingered too long after farewell, for unfinished stories, for silenced voices. But the figure waiting in the mist did not feel like a shadow of the past. It did not feel like the echo of someone lost. It was someone alive. Ailise felt the air shift again. She did not know whether to approach or stand perfectly still. The horse did not urge her. It simply waited, with the endless patience of something supernatural. The girl took a step into the fog, very slowly. The embers on the ground lit her boots from below. The horse's breath brushed her cheek like a cold caress. The human figure remained motionless. Ailise took another step. The mist seemed to open like a curtain. And then she saw enough. Enough for her voice to break into a whisper the night could barely carry. You? The horse lowered its head. The fog stirred. The earth breathed. Ailise felt that something was about to be revealed. Something ancient and sorrowful, yet deeply calm. The moor was not a place of terror that night. It was a place of passage. of meeting, of partings or callings. The horse struck the ground softly. The human figure stepped forward. The mist began just barely to pale. The story was about to open, like a secret that had waited far too long. And Ailise knew, without anyone needing to tell her, that her life would change from that moment on. The figure emerging from the fog seemed to come apart and gather itself again with every breath of the moor. Ailise felt the air vibrate around her, not in a threatening way, but as if she were about to hear a very old word, spoken from a place where time moved more slowly. She took another step, and the red glow of the horse's footprints lit the mist from below, revealing contours that were soft and imperfectly human. The girl's heart beat with a strange calm, keeping time with the hooves that no longer touched the ground. A deep stillness spread across the hills, a stillness that demanded neither bravery nor obedience, only presence. The human figure moved closer, and then the fog seemed to part, as though obeying a silent will. It was a boy, or at least that was what she saw first. His height, his youthful, slender build, dark hair hanging in damp strands. But there was something else, something that did not fully belong. His edges were paler than the rest of the world, as if part of him belonged to the air rather than to flesh. He was not transparent. He was not a ghost. He simply seemed suspended, as though he had not quite decided which side of existence he meant to remain on. Ailise felt a name rise to her lips before she had fully recognized his face. "Rowan," she whispered. The figure lifted his head. His eyes took a moment to focus. When they did, they settled on her with a soft, almost sorrowful light. And yet there was a tenderness in them that felt familiar, as if they had shared far more words than they really had. Rowan lived in a lonely house beyond the river of black water, where the trees grew close together and moss blanketed nearly every trunk. He was the son of a forest keeper who had gone away months earlier in search of work, leaving the boy in the care of an uncle who was hardly ever seen. Rowan often wandered along the edges of the moor, collecting stones or strange flowers he would later show Ailise when they happened to meet near the old stone marker at the crossroads. They had only spoken a handful of times, and yet there was a quiet understanding between them, as if they were two parts of the same landscape. Rowan was a gentle boy, slow in his movements, someone who listened more than he spoke. Ailise had always felt that he knew things about the land that others failed to notice. But he should not have been there that night. Not that far out. Not that pale. The black horse remained a little apart, as if watching over the scene with otherworldly patience. Its eyes glowed softly, and the dark vapor of its breath seemed to keep time with the mist itself. Rowan tried to speak, but his voice would not come at once. He raised a hand, and the gesture was human enough for Ailise to recognize the warmth still living inside him. He stepped toward her, and when he did, the fog retreated and revealed that his feet left no prints. They did not mark the earth. They did not even press it down. It was as though he only barely touched the world. Ailise felt a knot tighten in her throat. Not from grief, from revelation. The horse had not come for someone dead. It had come for someone living, for a different kind of crossing. At last, Rowan managed to form words, little more than a murmur. "I didn't know if you would come." His voice was muted, as though it passed through layers of old air before reaching her. But it was his voice. the same one Ailise had heard when he showed her a spiral-shaped stone he had found among the heather. Ailise swallowed. "I felt like I had to come," she said, "as if someone was calling me." Rowan lowered his head just slightly. "It was me," he said so softly. The fog seemed to steal the syllables before they cooled. The girl stared at him, eyes wide. The black horse gave a faint flick of its tail, a silent pulse marking a moment of transition. It was as if time had turned a page and moved into a new chapter. "But why?" Ailise asked, so quietly she barely recognized her own voice. Rowan folded his arms around himself. His shirt shifted faintly in a wind that did not exist, and Ailise suspected that movement came not from any breeze, but from the measured breath of the horse, which seemed to alter the air around them. The boy closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. "I got lost," he said. "Not the way you think. Not in the woods. I got lost. Inside myself." Ailise remained silent, letting the quiet of the unmoving hooves fill the space between them. The air had taken on a warmer undertone now, as if the moor itself had decided to wrap them in some kind of gentle protection. Rowan kept speaking, his voice flowing more than sounding. "3 nights ago, I went out looking for my uncle. He hadn't come back by dusk, and I thought he might still be near the old wood, cutting timber. I kept walking farther and farther, and then the fog reached me. It was different from this, heavier. It filled my head and my chest. And then, I don't know when it happened, but I stopped feeling my own footsteps. I stopped feeling the weight of my hands. It was as if the fog had drunk me in." Ailise took a slow breath. She knew the old stories of the moor spoke of ancient mists that could confuse even the most watchful travelers. But this felt like something deeper. "And the horse?" she asked, looking toward the animal's towering shadow. Rowan turned to it as well. His eyes brightened with a faint glimmer, as though simply seeing the horse was its own comfort. "I heard him before I saw him," he said, "like a heart that wasn't mine, showing me the way. When he appeared, I thought he had come to take me away. But that wasn't it. He came to find me, because I'm not fully here yet, and not fully there." Ailise needed a moment to take that in. The truth of it did not frighten her, not in the sharp way adults described fear. What she felt was something deep and gentle, as if the very soil of the moor had joined a conversation more intimate than any human could fully understand. "Why me?" she asked at last, almost under her breath. Rowan lowered his gaze. His voice became the brush of autumn leaves. "Because you reminded me there were things I hadn't said. I thought about the spiral stone, and the way you smiled when you saw it. I thought about your voice, and the way you listened to the land. About how I didn't feel quite so lost when I was with you." Ailise felt a quiet warmth bloom in her chest. It was not embarrassment, not surprise. It was something closer to the gentlest kind of tenderness, as if some small part of her, too, had been waiting for this meeting. The horse stepped closer to them. The embers of its tracks flared softly, spreading a reddish light over both their faces. Rowan drew a deep breath, and for one instant, he looked more solid, more present, as though the glow had returned some part of him to himself. "I think," he said, "he wants to take me back. Not away from the world, but toward my path again. But he can't do it alone. He needs someone to call me from this side, someone to remind me who I am." Ailise looked at the horse. The creature watched her with perfect calm, with an ancient patience that seemed born from centuries of walking through souls and fog. She took one step closer to Rowan. Her hands trembled a little, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I can do that." The mist shifted, as if approving her choice. Rowan looked at her with something new in his eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude. The horse lowered its head and came nearer. Its dark breath wrapped around the air, making it denser, warmer. Ailise felt as though the entire moor was holding her up. Rowan reached a hand out to her. "Just stay with me a little longer," he whispered. Ailise took his hand. She felt no cold, no emptiness, only the faintest pulse, barely a heartbeat. Rowan was not entirely lost, not while she was there. The fog began to turn slowly around the three of them, forming a soft circle, a whirl that carried nothing away but gathered everything in. The horse raised one hoof and set it down with a deep, resonant sound. The air trembled. The moor listened. The night opened a silent path. Ailise breathed in, bracing herself for whatever would come next. She thought she ought to say something, a word, a name, a gesture of memory. But before she could, a soft light began to glow beneath Rowan's feet, spreading like the faint reflection of a miniature dawn. The crossing was about to begin. The light rising beneath Rowan's feet was not harsh or blinding. It was more like a warm radiance, a clarity seeping through the blades of grass, as though it came from deep inside the earth itself. Ailise watched it spread slowly, forming a circle around the boy, sketching lines that seemed to mark an invisible boundary between what is and what might become. The black horse lowered its head, almost solemnly, as though greeting something ancient waking beneath the surface. The mist around the circle began to move with greater purpose, coiling into a spiral, not fast or violent, but slow and almost lazy, like a deep thought taking shape. Ailise did not let go of Rowan's hand. His palm was still warm, though now and then it seemed to fade at the edges, as if the border between skin and air had become dangerously thin. Each time it happened, the girl tightened her grip just a little, and she could feel his hand regain substance, as though her touch helped him remember the weight of his own body. Rowan inhaled calmly. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "It won't hurt me." Ailise nodded, though she did not feel afraid. What held her now was a strange blend of serenity and anticipation, like opening a very old book and hearing the pages murmur before revealing a story that had been sleeping for centuries. The boy looked down at the circle of light around him. "I think it's a threshold," he murmured. The mist seemed to agree, moving with the rhythm of a slow, even breath. The horse stepped forward once more, and where its hooves touched the grass, fresh embers appeared and burned in silence. They seemed to mark a road that joined the glowing circle surrounding Rowan, as though drawing a bridge between both sides of the moor, between the solid world and the one that waits patiently for those who lose their way. Ailise felt her heartbeat slow, falling into harmony with that living silence. "What do I have to do?" she asked softly, looking at the horse as though she expected him to answer, even while knowing he would need no words. It was Rowan who replied. "Just remember me," he said, with such unguarded sweetness that a tremor moved through her chest. "Remember me the way I was when we walked by the marker, when we picked the late heather flowers. Remember me as someone who is still here." Ailise closed her eyes for a few moments. She remembered the color of his eyes, a soft gray that turned almost silver in weak light. She remembered the way he could point out a hidden nest or a narrow stream half swallowed by undergrowth without saying much at all. She remembered the spiral stone he had given her, not as a gift exactly, but as something beautiful worth sharing. She remembered his small smile, the one that somehow lit up his whole face. When she opened her eyes again, the light around Rowan seemed to rise slightly, as though her memories had breathed energy back into him. The boy took a deep breath, and his feet began to feel more firmly planted on the ground. Not entirely, but enough for the circle of light to seem to hold him there. Ailise looked at him with quiet tenderness. "I always knew you belonged to this place," she whispered, "but not to the fog, to the earth, to whatever breathes here." Rowan lifted his gaze. There was something soft and fragile in his eyes now, but it was filled with hope. "That," he said, barely above a breath, "that helps." The horse stepped to the edge of the circle. Its shadow seemed to ripple and blend with the light. There was no opposition between them, no clash. It felt as if both forces, the brightness of the threshold and the deep darkness of the horse, were woven from the same thread. Ailise heard the faintest murmur in the air, a sound that came not from the animal, but from the moor itself. A reminder, or an invitation, or perhaps a blessing. Rowan squeezed her hand. "I think now," he said slowly, "the crossing can begin." But Ailise frowned very slightly and lifted her eyes to him. "I don't want you to go," she admitted with a truth that did not hurt to speak. It was a calm feeling, free of desperation, simply honest. Rowan smiled, a thin, warm smile. "It isn't leaving," he whispered. "It's returning." The mist stirred. The circle of light expanded by the width of a fingertip. The horse exhaled a dark vapor that settled over the earth like a soft cloak. The boy closed his eyes and took another step toward the center of the circle. Parts of him grew clearer, others fainter, as though his depth itself was changing. Ailise kept holding his hand, though now part of her own skin seemed wrapped in gentle light. The sound of the moor changed, not into a noise, but into the absence of one. A perfect pause. Without opening his eyes, Rowan spoke. "Ailise, can you tell me something? Something small, something yours, something that will anchor me." The girl breathed in, letting the calm of the place fill her chest. "Well," she began, and though her voice was low, it rang clear in the mist. "When I was little, I used to think the fog was made of whispers trapped between the trees. My grandmother said it was the voice of the moor, watching over those who listened. I always felt that the land here never leaves anyone alone." Rowan smiled, and his figure gained a little more weight, a little more substance. "I like that," he said, "the idea of not being alone." A wave of tenderness moved through Ailise. The horse lifted its ears, attentive, as if the story she was telling had become an essential part of the silent rite unfolding around them. The threshold light answered with a soft vibration. Rowan continued, his voice very low now. "I think I can do it." The light rose higher, becoming a soft column that reached his waist. The mist inside the circle began to climb slowly, as though weaving a bridge toward the hidden night sky above the grey veil. Ailise took a deep breath and stepped closer. Her hand trembled slightly when she felt Rowan's beginning to dissolve, not as though he were vanishing, but as though the air around him had become governed by different laws. Rowan opened his eyes. They were clear and calm, filled with a peaceful radiance. "Thank you," he whispered. "Will you come back?" she asked, surprised by the serenity in her own voice. The boy nodded. "Yes, I think now. I'll be able to return to the house, to the woods, to what I am. But I needed to remember there was something waiting for me here. Something that wanted me to come back." The horse took one final step toward the edge of the circle. Its shadow touched the light, and a sound rose so softly only the heart could hear it. A sound of return, a sound of home. Rowan began to lift very slowly, not upward, but inward into the light, as though it were drawing him in with the gentlest touch. The fog turned once around him, holding him in something like an embrace, and then, like a whisper fading with a quiet sigh, his figure dissolved into light. The circle shone for one more moment. The mist turned slowly. The horse breathed, and the moor held its silence. The light began to descend. Ailise waited. The air settled. And when the glow finally went out, something happened. A soft sound, grass bending, a firm step, and a familiar shape emerged from inside the threshold. Rowan, fully human, with life in his eyes. Ailise felt her lungs fill with warm air. The boy stepped toward her. "I'm back," he said, his whisper full of calm. Rowan's silhouette, now solid and fully present, stood in contrast to the quiet, wavering mist still drifting around him. It was him, not an echo, not a trembling reflection, but truly him. His steps pressed into the grass, his breathing had weight, and his eyes, as pale and bright as autumn skies under clouds, reflected the soft light of the moor. Ailise felt a deep relief, the kind that comes not with tears or hurried words, but as a warm tide that moves through the chest and spreads slowly outward. She did not let go of Rowan's hand until he stood close enough for their shadows to merge on the damp ground. Rowan lowered his eyes to his own body, as if he still needed proof that he had really returned. He flexed his fingers, watching the skin crease over his knuckles. Then he shifted one foot, pressing it into the wet grass, and feeling the coolness of the dew. "It's cold," he murmured, sounding almost surprised. Ailise smiled softly. "That's a good sign." Rowan looked up at her. There was something new in his eyes now. A warm brightness she did not remember seeing before. It was as though he had carried back a fragment of clarity from whatever luminous place he had touched. The black horse stood motionless a few paces behind them, its dark form cut into the mist, its ancient presence as deep and solemn as ever. Now that Rowan had returned, the creature seemed larger somehow, more stately, like a guardian that had fulfilled its purpose. Its eyes still held that bluish glow, but there was a gentleness in them now, the quiet softness of one who accompanies without demanding anything in return. The earth beneath its hooves was still lit by tiny embers, though each one seemed to dim slowly, as if the hidden fire of the moor were withdrawing to rest. Ailise stepped toward the horse, moving slowly, with the same care one might use when approaching a wild creature that breathes from a time older than one's own. The horse did not retreat. Instead, it lowered its neck just slightly, allowing the girl to look at it more closely. The darkness of its coat was not only color, it had depth to it, as though it held the echo of roads walked for centuries, where lost souls found their bearing again. The fog seemed to stroke it gently, slipping through its mane like an old companion. Rowan came to stand beside Ailise, still not fully letting go of her hand, as though he needed the quiet anchor of her presence just a little longer. "I think he wants to say goodbye," Rowan said softly. The girl nodded, horse, as though it understood, stepped once toward them. This time its hooves made no echo, only a murmur like a deep stream heard from very far away. The mist drew back with a kind of reverence, opening a small space for the faint light cast by the last glowing embers in the ground. Ailise slowly lifted one hand. She did not touch the horse, but brought it close enough to feel the cold air around its skin, air that seemed to hum with a steady force. The horse lowered its head until its muzzle was only inches from her hand. A current of breath escaped its nostrils, warm and soft despite the chill. "Thank you," Ailise whispered. Rowan echoed her, his voice low and barely trembling. "Thank you for bringing me back." The horse exhaled another cloud of dark vapor. Then it took one step back and turned its head toward the open stretch of moor, where the fog glowed thicker and brighter, like a road only it could see. But before it left, it turned once more toward the children. Its gaze was deep enough to hold many winters, many sunsets, many homecomings. And in that moment, Ailise felt something that was not quite thought, not quite instinct. A quiet certainty that the black horse was not a messenger of death at all, but a guardian of passage, a keeper of those who lose themselves inside their own fears, their broken memories, the invisible threads that sometimes draw the soul away from the body. After that final exchange, the horse lifted its head with grave dignity and began to walk into the fog. Its steps no longer left glowing embers behind. They seemed to grow lighter, almost weightless, as though the earth itself were helping it move forward. With each stride, it became a little less distinct, not because it was vanishing, but because it was blending into the mist, until at last its shadow could no longer be separated from it. And then it was gone, without noise, without a spoken farewell. Only a deep, gentle silence remained, hanging in the air like an ancient blessing. Ailise and Rowan stood still for a few moments, letting that silence settle over them like a blanket of calm. Then Rowan took a deeper breath, the first one that seemed to fully fill his lungs since his return. "I thought," he began, then stopped, searching for words that did not want to form. Ailise looked at him, giving him time. "That you wouldn't come back?" she finished softly. Rowan nodded, barely. "Yes. There was a moment before he appeared, when I couldn't remember what it felt like to be here, to feel the ground holding you, to feel that the air belonged to you. I was far away, and I thought maybe none of it mattered anymore. But then I remembered your voice, and the stone marker, and the late heather flowers. I remembered that I wanted to come back to that." Ailise felt a warm, steady tightness in her throat. Not sorrow, recognition. "I'm glad you came back," she whispered. Rowan smiled in that quiet, slight way she knew so well. "So am I." The fog began to thin, revealing the dark line of the hills and the edge of the path that led back to her grandmother's cottage. The night was still dense, but it no longer seemed full of uneasy mystery. Now it carried a kind and guiding stillness. Ailise drew a slow breath. "We should go back," she said. Rowan looked once toward the place where the horse had disappeared, then nodded calmly. "Yes. Though," he added in a voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the mist, "I don't think I'll ever forget this place, or this night." They walked together, slowly, following a path that was barely visible beneath the dim light of the hidden moon. But it was enough. The fog withdrew gently before them, as if it recognized they had already fulfilled their part in the old cycle of the moor. Ailise felt the world around her not as a burden, but as a presence beside her. The twisted oaks seemed to keep watch over them. The damp heather gave off a scent that eased the chest. Every step was a return, not only to the cottage, but to something deeper inside themselves. Rowan said little, but his silence was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of life. When the cottage finally began to take shape through the mist, Ailise noticed the warm glow in the window. Her grandmother must have awakened and lit the oil lamp, perhaps uneasy over the girl's absence. Rowan stopped a few paces from the door. "Do you think I should go home now?" he asked quietly. Ailise looked at him. The night still covered the moor, but it no longer felt dangerous or uncertain. "You can stay a little while," she said, "until dawn shows itself. My grandmother will understand." Rowan smiled again, and together they crossed the last stretch while the fog thinned around them, as if the moor, satisfied with what had passed, were slowly falling back to sleep. The warm glow of the lamp in the window seemed to embrace the lingering mist over the meadow, forming a golden halo that trembled softly with each faint breeze. Ailise stopped for a moment before the threshold, watching that light create a small refuge in the heart of the night. Rowan stood beside her, quiet, breathing more deeply now that the hush around them had begun to feel more human, more familiar. The girl lifted a hand toward the latch, but she did not open the door immediately. She turned toward Rowan, who was looking around with a serene expression, as though rediscovering every small detail. The sound of the moor felt different now that he had returned. There was an almost musical undertone in the way the grass moved and the breeze brushed against the cottage walls. "Do you feel all right?" Ailise asked in a murmur. Rowan nodded, though his gaze was still fixed on the fog slowly retreating toward the hills. "I feel here," he answered. "I haven't felt that in days, maybe weeks." Ailise asked nothing more. She sensed there were shadows of thought inside him that were still settling into place, and that pressing him for answers might disturb the fragile calm that had just been born. Instead, she opened the door gently. A sweet scent of thyme and chamomile drifted out from inside, mingling with the freshness of the night. Ailise's grandmother sat near the hearth, a blanket draped across her knees, her eyes half closed. When she heard the door creak, she lifted her head slowly. Her tired but watchful gaze fell first on her granddaughter, and then on Rowan. There was no shocked cry, no abrupt question, only a deep silence full of meaning, as though the old woman had already sensed that something beyond the ordinary had happened that night. Her wrinkled, warm hands tightened slightly around the blanket before she spoke. "Come in, both of you," she said, her voice soft as breath. Ailise entered first, and Rowan followed with light steps. The cottage was small but welcoming, a worn wooden table, herbs hanging from the beams, candles long gone cold except for one, the faint murmur of the fire still keeping a few live embers. The light moved over the walls, throwing shadows that seemed to breathe with them. The grandmother looked at Rowan with a mixture of tenderness and old recognition. "You crossed paths with the ancient mist," she said, without any need for him to explain. Rowan lowered his head respectfully. "Yes." The woman studied him carefully. Her eyes seemed to look beyond his face, as though searching for the part of him that had once gone missing. After a few seconds, she nodded with quiet gravity. "And someone called you back," she added, looking at Ailise with the faintest glimmer of silent pride. "Well done, my girl." Ailise felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, gentle satisfaction. Rowan spoke then, his voice heavy with gratitude. "The horse," he began, but the grandmother lifted one hand slowly, never sharply. "There's no need to describe him," she said. "I've heard his steps more than once in my life. He never comes without a purpose. He never loses his way. And he never mistakes the soul he's meant to find." Rowan nodded, and the woman gestured toward a chair near the fire. He sat down, feeling the warmth against his skin, like an unexpected gift. Ailise settled nearby, letting the stillness fold around them. For a while, none of them spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence woven by the night itself, by the mist lingering outside, by the sheltering warmth of the home around them. Rowan's breathing grew steadier, as if the fire were helping fasten him back into the world. The grandmother prepared an infusion in the iron kettle, mixing leaves that released a deeply comforting aroma. Steam rose in soft spirals, echoing the turning fog on the moor. She poured 2 cups, one for Rowan and one for Ailise. "Drink slowly," she murmured. "Nights like this leave marks on the chest. They have to be soothed little by little." Rowan wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the heat spread through his fingers, carrying away the last chill he had brought with him. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and the sweet taste returned to him, a sense of belonging he had thought lost. The grandmother watched that gesture with calm attention. "You'll go back to your house when the sun begins to rise," she said, though Rowan had not spoken of leaving at dawn. "Not before. The mist is still breathing tonight, and you need rest." The boy did not argue. He seemed content to yield to the wisdom of that old woman. Ailise, sipping her own infusion, fixed her eyes on the fire. The flames threw shadows that seemed to tell silent stories. Stories of other nights like this one, of other returns, of other presences that had once shared the warmth of that same room. After a while, Rowan spoke again. "When I was lost, I thought the world was only an echo, as if I were walking through a place where nothing had any weight. Even my own thoughts felt distant, like they didn't belong to me. But the horse, he held me together. He guided me. And your voice," he said, turning to Ailise, "anchored me to something real." Ailise felt a quiet knot form in her throat. It was not painful. It was like hearing a melody that wakes old memories without hurting them. "I only remembered who you were," she said. Rowan smiled, small and sincere. "Sometimes that's more than enough." The grandmother smiled faintly too, the kind of wise smile that needed no words. The fire kept crackling. Outside, the fog touched the window softly, like a patient visitor. Rowan leaned back slightly in the chair. He was not tired in a purely physical sense, but it was clear that all of him needed time to readjust to gravity, to the simple weight of being alive. Ailise watched him with a quiet tenderness, feeling the moor still surrounding them from beyond the walls. When the embers began to fade, the grandmother pointed to a small pallet against the wall. "Rest there for a few hours," she told Rowan. "You are safe here." Rowan inclined his head in gratitude. He lay down slowly, as though he were still becoming accustomed to the solidity of his own body. Ailise slipped into her own bed near the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of dried lavender. Silence filled the cottage. The night was gentle. Rowan's breathing deepened and steadied. The fog gathered itself beyond the walls, and the moor, satisfied at last, sank into a long and peaceful sleep. Before closing her eyes, Ailise thought for one moment of the black horse moving through the mist, searching for other souls who had forgotten the way back. She thought of its dark shape, its blue eyes, the quiet grace with which it disappeared into the hills. And inside her, she felt a gratitude both light and deep, like a breeze that touches without disturbing. Then she let sleep take her slowly, the way fog enfolds the hills. Warm sleep, peaceful sleep. The night moved forward in silence, and far beyond the edge of the world, dawn was already preparing to arrive. Morning came first as the faintest sigh. A pale grey light began to filter through the cracks in the window, mingling with the last reddish sparks sleeping in the embers. The silence inside the cottage was so deep, it seemed to hold up the air itself, as though it did not wish to disturb the peace that had just settled there. Ailise opened her eyes slowly. The blanket wrapped around her like a warm embrace, and the last traces of sleep still clung to her eyelids. She sat up carefully, listening to Rowan's soft breathing as he slept on the pallet near the wall. His chest rose and fell with almost perfect calm, as if each exhale rooted him a little more firmly back into the world. The girl rose without making a sound. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet, but the chill felt pleasant, like the air that announces the arrival of a peaceful new day. She crossed to the window. Outside, the mist was lifting little by little, rising toward the hills like a veil, withdrawing after a long vigil. It did not vanish all at once. It receded slowly, with an ancient rhythm that seemed to respect the sleep of those who had shared it. The moor looked different beneath the first light of dawn. The shadows softened. The heather took on blush-pink tones. The wind, still light, carried the fresh scent of wet grass. Ailise thought for a moment of the black horse, its towering form, the embers beneath its hooves, the deep gaze that seemed to know the hidden roads of the soul. She wondered where it might be now. Perhaps on another hill, perhaps at another threshold between presence and loss, or perhaps simply walking as a living part of the very mist that was now retreating. "Good morning," came a drowsy voice behind her. Ailise turned. Rowan had pushed himself upright and was rubbing his eyes with one hand. His hair was tousled, and a healthy flush had returned to his cheeks for the first time since before he vanished into the fog. "Good morning," she answered quietly. Rowan looked around, as though making sure the place was still real. In his eyes, she saw a mixture of relief and wonder, the look of someone returning from a silent journey that could never be fully explained. Ailise's grandmother emerged just then from the small adjoining room, wrapped in a grey shawl. She moved slowly, with the same calm dignity that always seemed to accompany her, as if she carried the old wisdom of the moor within her. She looked at the two children with a soft, composed smile. "You both slept well," she said, more as a certainty than a question. Rowan nodded. So did Ailise. The old woman moved to the hearth, added a few dry twigs, and stirred the fire back to life. The smell of burning wood filled the cottage with familiar warmth. Then she set a small pot of porridge to cook, and its sweet aroma began to gather around the three of them. "You must eat before you go, boy," she said to Rowan. "When the body finds its way back, it needs food to remind it of the world." Rowan smiled softly. He asked no questions. He simply sat at the table, and Ailise took the seat beside him. They ate slowly, without hurry, letting the warmth of the food blend with the stillness of the morning. When they had finished, Rowan laid his spoon down and looked at the grandmother with transparent gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "Thank the moor," the old woman answered, "and the one who called you back." Rowan turned his gaze to Ailise. His grey eyes met hers, and in that exchange there was something that needed no words, only a quiet recognition, a thread between them that held no strain, only calm. The grandmother stepped away a little, giving them space to speak. "I'm not sure how to thank you for what you did," Rowan said, his voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with a gentle emotion. Ailise slowly shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. You came back. That's enough." Rowan lowered his gaze for a moment. "It's strange," he admitted. "Now that I'm here, the memory of the place where I was is already growing faint, like it's dissolving. But I'm not afraid of forgetting it. I only feel that it was a crossing, and that it's over now." Ailise felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest. She asked nothing more. She knew there were experiences that did not need to be explained, because their meaning did not live in words, but in the way they changed what a person carried inside. A few drops of golden light began to paint the floorboards. At last, the sun had slipped through the thinning fog. Rowan stood. "I think it's time for me to go home," he said, looking toward the door. His voice was firm now, his presence steady. Ailise walked out with him. Her grandmother remained in the doorway, watching them with deep eyes full of silent affection. The moor stretched before them beneath the light of day, in warm violets and muted golds. The heather glittered with dew. The oaks, still wrapped in the faintest veil, looked like ancient guardians. The mist withdrew like a slow river returning to its course. Rowan breathed in the fresh air and let the wind brush against his skin. "I'll never forget this night," he murmured. "Neither will I," Ailise replied. They walked together for a short distance, until they reached the fork in the path. One road led back toward the grandmother's cottage. The other cut toward the woods and Rowan's home. There they stopped. Rowan looked at the path waiting for him, then back at Ailise. He smiled in that small but luminous way that was so completely his. "Will I see you soon?" he asked. Ailise smiled back softly, as though the gesture belonged to the morning itself. "Always. The moor doesn't let its paths forget each other." Rowan nodded, as if accepting a truth larger than words. Then, with one final, quiet gesture, he turned and began to walk toward home. His steps were steady. The sun lit his figure as he moved away, and though mist still curled along the far hills, he walked without fear, like someone who had already crossed the hardest threshold of all. Ailise watched him until his shape grew small between the trees. Then she turned back toward the cottage, where the scent of time still lingered in the air. She sat for a moment on the stone step and closed her eyes, letting the soft wind brush her face. The night had left marks on her, but they were not marks of fear or shadow. They were marks of passage, of meeting, of identity. Inside herself, she carried the certainty of having taken part in something ancient and quiet, guided by the black horse that roamed Dartmoor on nights of fog. And she knew, with a deep and peaceful certainty, that the story would live on in the earth, in the mist, and in her heart, like a soft flame that never burns too brightly and never goes out. Morning spread slowly over the moor. The fog withdrew toward the distant hills, and Ailise, her soul at peace, stepped back inside the cottage and let the warmth of home embrace her once more. The black horse did not appear again that day, but somewhere in Dartmoor, its hooves still kept time for the souls that were searching for their way back. And the girl knew, without needing to see it, that one day the mist would once again carry the soft echo of burning hooves, reminding her that there are paths that exist only for those who listen to the earth with an open heart. Peace settled over the moor. The story closed beneath the light of dawn, and an ancient whisper remained in the air, suspended there like a farewell or a promise.